The North African desert stretches endlessly, a sea of burning gold beneath an unforgiving sun. The wind howls through dunes like the whisper of ghosts, and the horizon shimmers with heat that blurs the line between sky and sand. In the summer of 1940, that desert became the pride and the curse of Mussolini's empire. From his balcony in Rome, Benito Mussolini believed he was watching the dawn of a new Roman conquest. France had fallen, Britain was isolated, and Hitler's armies were unstoppable across Europe. To Mussolini, it seemed the perfect moment to carve Italy's own empire, one built on speed, glory, and Mediterranean domination. His generals, dressed in crisp uniforms and swollen with arrogance, promised him an easy victory. They laughed at the British troops stationed in Egypt, a small, scattered force of colonial soldiers, they claimed, too weak to resist the mighty Italian 10th Army. In the marble halls of Rome, victory was spoken of as a formality. In Tripoli and Benghazi, officers toasted to the fall of Egypt before the first shot was fired. In September 1940, under Mussolini's orders, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, commander of the Italian 10th Army, began the invasion of Egypt from Libya. With over 150,000 men, 1,600 guns, and 500 tanks, Graziani's force dwarfed the British presence across the border. But the numbers masked a rot beneath the surface: outdated tanks, unreliable vehicles, poor communication, and low morale among conscripts who barely understood why they were there. As Graziani's columns rolled eastward across the sand, they looked impressive: endless lines of trucks, artillery, and tanks kicking up clouds of dust that shimmered in the heat. Italian war correspondents filmed the advance, calling it the new March of Empire. But beneath that grandeur, confusion reigned. Logistics broke down almost immediately. Supply trucks ran out of fuel. Water convoys lost direction. Radios failed in the heat. By the time the Italians reached Sidi Barrani, just 60 miles into Egypt, the offensive stalled completely. Graziani, cautious and uncertain, ordered his men to dig in and build fortified camps, static positions in the middle of the desert. It was a fatal mistake. The Italians believed they were preparing to defend their gains. In reality, they were building targets. Across the border, the British Western Desert Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, watched in silence. O'Connor had only 36,000 men, 275 tanks, and a fraction of the artillery his enemy possessed. But what he lacked in numbers, he made up for in precision, discipline, and mobility. His men, British, Australian, Indian, and New Zealand troops, had trained for months in desert warfare. They moved fast, struck hard, and lived by one rule: never fight where the enemy expects you to. To the Italians, the desert was a static map, a place to occupy and hold. To O'Connor, it was an open ocean of opportunity. As the months passed, the Italian camps at Sidi Barrani grew complacent. Soldiers lounged in the sun. Officers reported no British activity. The propaganda machine in Rome declared victory in Egypt inevitable. Mussolini himself promised that Italian tanks would soon roll through Alexandria. But in the desert, mirages can be deadly. While the Italians dug trenches, O'Connor was preparing something far more dangerous: a blitzkrieg in the sand, a lightning counterattack so sudden and precise that it would destroy the Italian dream before it truly began. And when the British struck, they wouldn't just defeat an army, they would shatter an illusion. The illusion that Italy's empire was strong, that Mussolini's generals were competent, and that arrogance could ever replace skill. In a war defined by tanks, air power, and speed, the Italians were still fighting like it was 1918. They didn't know it yet, But the desert would become their graveyard, and their laughter at the British would soon turn into desperate silence. The storm was coming. Operation Compass was about to begin. In the cold dawn of December 9th, 1940, the silence of the desert shattered. The British Western Desert Force, after months of planning and reconnaissance, launched Operation Compass, a limited 5-day raid that would turn into one of the most astonishing victories of the entire war. While the Italians slept in their sandbagged camps near Sidi Barrani, the British attacked with surgical precision. Instead of a massive frontal assault, O'Connor's men moved through the desert's blind spots, navigating the dunes under cover of night, using compass bearings and starlight. The Italians had believed the desert was impassable to large mechanized units. They were wrong. At 5 a.m., the British 7th Armored Division, known as the Desert Rats, and the 4th Indian Division struck hard. British Matilda, 2 tanks, slow but heavily armored, rolled forward like steel fortresses. The Italian anti-tank guns, designed for an older kind of war, bounced shells uselessly off the Matilda's thick armor. The sound of ricocheting rounds filled the air as the British infantry followed close behind, bayonets fixed, cutting through stunned defenders. Inside the Italian camps, chaos erupted. Many officers were still asleep or completely unaware of the scale of the attack. Telephone lines had been destroyed. Command posts were overrun. Entire battalions tried to flee, only to be cut down by British machine gun fire. By midday, the once invincible 10th Army was in full retreat. British columns captured entire strongholds within hours. Thousands of Italian soldiers surrendered without firing a shot, hungry, dehydrated, and demoralized. O'Connor's men seized tons of supplies, fuel, and vehicles. Even the Italian airfields fell quickly, with British aircraft now dominating the skies. But O'Connor didn't stop. He saw the weakness, and he pressed it. What was meant to be a 5-day raid became a relentless 500-mile pursuit across the desert. Town after town, garrison after garrison, Bardia, Tobruk, Derna, Benghazi, all fell in rapid succession. The British moved with lightning speed, cutting off Italian retreat routes and capturing thousands more each day. The terrain that had once seemed endless and hostile now worked against the Italians, who had no fuel, no coordination, and no will to fight. Convoys ran out of petrol. Tanks were abandoned in the sand. Entire divisions vanished into captivity. By February 1941, the once 150,000-strong 10th Army had disintegrated. Over 130,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner, more than the total number of British troops who had started the campaign. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. In Rome, Mussolini was humiliated. His generals, who had mocked the British as weak colonial soldiers, were now exposed as arrogant and incompetent. The propaganda that had promised a new Roman Empire turned to ash. For the British, Operation Compass became a symbol of daring and tactical brilliance, a masterclass in mobility, timing, and deception. The Desert Rats had earned their name. They had taken the enemy's confidence and turned it into their greatest weapon. But as O'Connor's forces swept through Libya, something else was brewing far to the north, a reaction from Germany. The collapse of Italy's army had forced Hitler's hand. He could no longer ignore the disaster unfolding in North Africa, and soon a new enemy would arrive in the desert, one far more dangerous than Graziani's broken legions. His name was Erwin Rommel. The Afrika Korps was on its way. By February 1941, the Italian Empire in North Africa lay in ruins. Entire divisions had surrendered. convoys burned under the desert sun. British troops had advanced 500 miles in just 8 weeks, one of the fastest campaigns in modern warfare. London was triumphant. Rome was in shock. But in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was furious. Italy's failure had opened a hole in the Axis front, threatening the entire Mediterranean strategy. The Führer decided to intervene, not with another puppet force, but with Germany's best. He sent in one man to restore the front, General Erwin Rommel. Rommel arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, with the newly formed Deutsches Afrika Korps, a small but elite armored force. His orders were defensive: hold the line, stabilize the Italians, and buy time. But Rommel was not a man who waited for orders. The moment his boots hit the sand, he began preparing to attack. He studied the terrain, learned the wind patterns, the dunes, the wadis. He inspected the wreckage of Italian tanks, listened to prisoners, and realized something vital. The British believed the Axis was finished in Africa. They were overstretched, undersupplied, and exhausted from months of pursuit. Rommel saw an opening, and he intended to exploit it. Within weeks, he launched a counterattack that no one expected. Moving with the speed and aggression that would earn him his nickname, the Desert Fox, Rommel turned defense into blitzkrieg. His tanks, the Paz 3 and Paz 4, moved like desert predators, striking weak flanks, cutting supply lines, and encircling positions with shocking precision. British patrols, expecting scattered Italians, suddenly found themselves ambushed by fast-moving German armor. Their own tanks, like the light cruisers and A9s, were outgunned and out-armored. German 88mm guns, originally designed for anti-aircraft fire, tore through British armor like paper. By April 1941, Rommel had recaptured El Agheila, Mersa Brega, Benghazi, Derna, and finally Mechili. The British were forced into a full retreat, falling back hundreds of miles to the fortified port city of Tobruk. The siege began. Rommel surrounded Tobruk with a ring of steel, cutting off its supply lines and bombarding it day and night. But the garrison, mostly Australian and British troops, refused to surrender. They dug in, built underground tunnels, and fought back with unbreakable tenacity. For months, the desert became a battleground of ambushes, supply raids, and deadly duels between tank columns. Rommel's genius shone through. His ability to read terrain, anticipate moves, and strike before the enemy even realized he was there. His men worshipped him. Even his enemies respected him. The British began referring to him not just as Rommel, but as the Desert Fox, the cunning predator who struck fast and vanished into the dunes. But his brilliance came at a cost. The further his forces advanced, the thinner his supply lines stretched. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, all had to come across the Mediterranean, where British submarines and aircraft hunted Axis convoys relentlessly. Every tank that reached the desert had already survived a gauntlet of danger. Still, Rommel pressed on. To him, speed and surprise were worth more than caution. He pushed his men and machines to the limit, and for a time, it worked. By the summer of 1942, he was at the gates of Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India and the East. The world watched as the fate of North Africa hung in the balance. The British had been beaten back again and again, but they were not finished. In Cairo, a new commander was preparing to stop Rommel once and for all, General Bernard Montgomery. Two giants were about to clash in the desert. One a master of instinct, the other of discipline. The coming battle would decide not just North Africa, but the future of the entire war. By the autumn of 1942, The North African campaign had reached its breaking point. The desert was no longer a place of maneuver and opportunity. It had become a graveyard of men, machines, and ambition. The Africa Corps, once unstoppable, was exhausted. Supplies were running dry. The tanks that once thundered across the dunes were now starving for fuel. Rommel, worn and sick, but still defiant, stood on the western approaches to El Alamein, the last defensive barrier before the Nile Delta and the Suez Canal. If he broke through here, he would not just defeat the British, he would cripple the entire Allied position in the Middle East. It was Germany's last real chance to turn the tide in Africa. But facing him now was a man cut from a different cloth, General Bernard Law Montgomery. Unlike Rommel's impulsive, instinct-driven approach, Montgomery was methodical, deliberate, and ruthlessly organized. He rebuilt the Eighth Army into a powerful, disciplined force. He demanded absolute coordination and confidence from his men. No more hasty advances. No more overextension. The British would strike when ready, and when they did, they would strike like a hammer. Montgomery understood that Rommel's real weakness wasn't courage or tactics. It was logistics. The Africa Corps was running on fumes, dependent on supplies shipped across the Mediterranean from Italy. Allied naval power and air superiority were strangling those supply lines. For every 10 fuel trucks that left Tripoli, barely 2 reached Rommel's front lines. The rest were sunk, captured, or burned. On the night of October 23, 1942, under a dark desert sky, the British launched Operation Lightfoot, a massive artillery barrage that lit up the horizon like a second sunrise. Over 800 guns fired in unison, pounding Axis defenses for hours. The ground shook. Sandstorms rose from the concussion of shells. Rommel's men, dug deep in trenches and bunkers, could only wait and pray. The next morning, waves of British infantry and armor began their slow, grinding advance through German minefields. The desert erupted into chaos. Rommel, returning from a brief medical leave in Europe, raced back to the front and immediately took command. He ordered counterattacks, flanking maneuvers, and defensive shifts, but the British tide was relentless. Montgomery refused to gamble. Every move was calculated, every unit had its role. The British had more tanks, more fuel, and crucially, more information. Allied intelligence had cracked Axis communications through ultra-intercepts, allowing Montgomery to anticipate Rommel's plans before they unfolded. For 12 brutal days, the desert became a storm of fire and steel. German and Italian troops fought with desperate courage, but their machines failed, their guns overheated, and their lines buckled. By November 2nd, Rommel knew the truth. He could no longer hold. His army was being ground to dust. He requested permission from Hitler to retreat. The answer came back cold and uncompromising: victory or death. But Rommel was no fanatic. He ignored the order. His duty was to his men, not to the delusions of Berlin. Under the cover of night, he began a fighting withdrawal westward. The once proud Africa Corps fell back mile by mile, chased by Montgomery's relentless pursuit. By early 1943, they were cornered in Tunisia, their strength shattered, their tanks burning, their air cover gone. What had begun with arrogance and confidence ended in exhaustion and despair. Rommel fought on until the end of his supplies and the end of his hope. He returned to Germany a hero to his troops, but a man haunted by the futility of it all. The desert that once seemed like a stage for his genius had become his undoing. And so, the Battle of El Alamein became a turning point not just for North Africa, but for the entire war. It marked the first major Allied victory against the Axis on land. From that moment, the myth of Axis invincibility began to crack. Winston Churchill later said it best: "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The desert, once a symbol of Axis might, had swallowed their dreams whole. By early 1943, the North African desert that had once echoed with the roar of German engines was now filled with the sound of defeat. The Afrika Korps, the once feared spearhead of Hitler's empire, was cornered. From El Agheila to Tunis, the Great Retreat stretched over 1,000 miles. Each step westward was a reminder of what had been lost: momentum, power, and hope. Rommel, the desert fox who had once terrified the British, now faced an enemy that outnumbered and outgunned him in every direction. American and British forces, newly coordinated under General Eisenhower, pressed in from the west after landing in Operation Torch, while Montgomery's hardened Eighth Army closed in from the east. The Axis were trapped between two Allied hammers. The German High Command ordered Rommel to hold Tunisia at all costs, but Rommel knew the reality. His divisions were starving, their tanks destroyed, their air support minimal. The once sleek panzers were now rusted wrecks, cannibalized for spare parts. Thousands of Italian soldiers fought with outdated rifles, while the Luftwaffe could no longer challenge Allied air dominance. Every convoy from Europe was intercepted, every attempt at resupply cut off by Allied naval power. Still, Rommel refused to abandon his men. He fought delaying actions at Mareth, El Hama, and Medellin, moving from position to position, directing defenses in person, often under fire. His presence alone still inspired soldiers to fight a little longer. But inspiration couldn't replace fuel. It couldn't fill empty stomachs or conjure ammunition from the sand. By March 1943, the inevitable had come. Rommel was recalled to Germany, officially for health reasons, but in truth, because Berlin knew the North African front was lost. He left behind his troops, men who still looked to him as their commander, and returned to a homeland already drowning in the next phase of war. 2 months later, on May 13, 1943, the Afrika Korps and Italian First Army surrendered in Tunisia. Over 250,000 Axis troops laid down their arms, an entire army group wiped from the map. For Germany, it was a humiliation second only to Stalingrad. For the Allies, it was a long-awaited triumph. North Africa, after 3 years of brutal desert warfare, was finally in their hands. But Rommel's story didn't end there. Back in Germany, the man once celebrated as Hitler's golden general grew increasingly disillusioned. He saw the madness of Berlin's leadership, the futility of endless bloodshed. His respect for courage remained, but his faith in Nazi ideology had vanished. By 1944, his name would become linked to the July 20th plot against Hitler, a plot that would seal his fate. When the Gestapo came for him, Rommel was given a choice: face a show trial that would disgrace his family, or take his own life in silence. The Desert Fox chose silence. On October 14, 1944, he drank the poison capsule given to him by Hitler's envoys. He died in his home, not on the battlefield, but still wearing his uniform, the same man who had once rewritten the rules of desert warfare. In the end, Rommel's legacy became complex. To his soldiers, he was a tactical genius, bold, loyal, and humane compared to others in the Nazi command. To historians, he remains a man trapped by circumstance, a brilliant commander serving a monstrous regime. But to the world, he is remembered for something deeper: his ability to turn barren sand into a theater of war, where speed, courage, and ingenuity triumphant, even if only for a time. The North African campaign stands as a testament to the fragility of power. The desert doesn't forgive arrogance. It doesn't remember who started the war. It remembers who endured. Rommel's victories taught the world what was possible. His defeat taught it what was inevitable. And as the dust finally settled over the dunes of Libya and Egypt, the legend of the Desert Fox became part of World War II's immortal history. A story of brilliance undone by hubris, and of a war machine that could conquer land, but not fate. If you were captivated by this true story of strategy, sacrifice, and the harsh lessons of war, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to WWII Heroes Legends, where history's most powerful stories of courage and consequence are brought back to life, one battle at a time.